Welcome everybody, TokenStandard Live. I am here, J Snook, here with my good friend Mickey McManus, who I'll introduce to you in a second. He's got a whiteboard behind him, which is the first guest to have done that, and I know Mickey. So he said, I don't know if I'm going to write on it or not. I guarantee you, you're in for a real treat tonight on multiple levels. And this will be very visual, I imagine, as well. So thanks, Mickey, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris.
You are in the Bay Area today, and we're excited to have you. So, guys, as you know, TokenStandard is serving just basically three core audiences, Mickey. So, for your edification, we seek to help smart money managers, people that are figuring out asset and asset class movement and capital flows and macroeconomic things and how they might be impacting investments or things like that. That's one segment of the audience to understand not only the thinking that might be putting forces in play that need to be thought about or calculated in. The other audience is the C-level or the executive level person managing a team, a division, a region, or an enterprise that is tasked with being responsible for hundreds, if not thousands of lives and trying to understand how to navigate their company through this shift that we're all in as we move to the fourth industrial revolution. And then the third kind of segment would be the people that are doing, the designers, the product leaders, the engineers, the DevOps folks, or for the hungry ones, the startup founders that are looking to disrupt or construct what might be next. So those are our three audiences, guys. If you want, you can let me know which one of those you are. I'm going to throw a little poll up here just for you to kind of do while we introduce Mickey. But Mickey is a lot of things. I'm going to let him kind of tell you what he thinks is most important. I can tell you this, that we've known each other maybe now for just under a year, I think. We met at Bon and Val's birthday party, and that was a serendipitous moment that I'll treasure for the rest of my life. And so Trillions was a book that you wrote several years ago. I can't remember exactly when it came out, maybe 11, 12, somewhere?
2012, end of 2012.
2012. And so on episode 1 of TokenStandard, we had Rebecca Costa on talking about Watchman's Rattle and On the Verge and foreknowledge, predictive analytics, complexity and collapse, and our DNA as it struggles to continue to operate inside of this environment. But why I think it's so apropos to almost on the back of that, as we had Oz on last week talking about cybersecurity and regulation and all these things, these big decision points, right? I think that it's very fitting, and I appreciate you being able to make it on this episode because you really kind of wrote the book along with your co-authors about this new world we're living in, this interconnected industrial internet world. We'll let you talk about what that means. But you were talking about this, almost a decade ago, and now you've got Project Primordial, which started several years ago. We're going to get into that. But level set us on Trillions and kind of what we're talking about today, and then this movement towards what you are currently kind of semantically calling the cognitive depression.
Yeah. Well, Chris, thanks for having me on. A few years ago when we wrote Trillions, I was with a design science lab called Maya. And it had come out of Carnegie Mellon, and it was all about, since 1989, taming complexity, because we believed that complexity was going to be the big enemy of the future. And I think a lot of people thought we're entering, this electronic age, and it would be this panacea. And it's good to kind of really put this in perspective. So I'm going to try to draw here to start with. In 1900, computing was a career. That was a cool job you could get. You tabulated numbers. So they were humans, and you'd be hired. And during World War II, we had huts full of people, like basically tabulating to try to break crypto and things like that, to try to understand enemy movement. In the 1950s, actually, it was just a big building called Colossus. So there were like 5 in the world. And they were the size of buildings, and when they said they had bugs, it might have actually been like a mouse knocking over a tube or something, And the chairman of IBM at the time said there might be a worldwide market for 5 computers, electronic computers. They named them after the human career. So not a big deal, not a lot of complexity. In fact, nobody but city-states, nation-states, et cetera, even dealt with complexity of any scale. Maybe if you were trying to understand biology, you were dealing with a lot of complexity. or running a big factory, but that was usually a big company or doing big military things. It's huge complexity. Nobody could afford it. But then you kind of move on, and suddenly we climb this giant mountain, and we have billions of supercomputers in our pocket. Like, literally, that's a big deal. Like, we all have something more powerful than what got us to the moon in our pocket. Yeah. Billions. In fact, I think we now have more cell phones than people.
We do. Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but I know it went over more people like last year sometime.
And the first Internet of Things devices came out, and they were called smartphones. And they kind of broke the computer free of a desktop, and they put it out into the world, and suddenly it could actually be in context for the first time ever. In 2010, we had about the semiconductor industry made more transistors than grains of rice, and cheaper. So everyone kept seeing that there was going to be a bigger world. Let's call it the industrial IoT. Back then, they called it machine-machine. But what they didn't really understand was that this bigger world had like some cliffs in between it, and trillions is actually like much bigger. I could kind of go off and over, and I could draw it to the other side. And people stood on this mountain and said, wow, I could get to that big mountain, and I'll use all the tools invented in the 60s, like C++ was, I think, 72, and like Unix was 69. I could use all the stuff from the last invention period to get there. And they confused a good view with a short distance. They didn't understand that they have to fundamentally think differently. And so trillions was about the rise of basically trillions of things. What happens when we have trillions of connected things? Most analysts believe that's less than 5 years away from right now. And those aren't trillions of disconnected things. The complexity rises when you connect them because you get feedback loops. And it's not just trillions of disconnected or reconnected things. It's trillions of things sending billions of messages, having a mind of their own. And so the book was really about what happens when we enter an era of unbounded, malignant complexity. Because even the best brands in the world, think of the IoT device that was on the market a few years ago that lied about its emissions when you drove it down the road. Right. It was a pretty well-known brand that wrote code to basically lie when it was being tested, only when it was being tested. Right. So it's unbounded and malignant complexity. And trillions was really, to close this, what do we do? Are there any design patterns that we can learn from? Has anyone else dealt with trillions of things in a sane way? And it turns out a big part of our book is about biomimicry for information systems. It turns out nature's been there before. You, my friend Chris, you have maybe 50 trillion cells in your body, just you. Right. And you're a complex information system, and you're right. You're going to go 100 years without a catastrophic failure, hopefully, maybe more. And you have different design patterns than any computing system today. If you cut your leg, it doesn't call the cloud up here in your brain. It actually calls all its buddies, and it's all peer-to-peer. And memory is so cheap in nature, there's a spare copy of you in every cell. So it's sort of massively peer-to-peer at the bottom, but it's not only. There's a layer of endocrine. There's a layer of circulatory. There's a layer of nervous system. So nature chose this sort of layered complexity. And those are patterns we could learn from. So the first book was really about, we've entered this sea of information devices. And it could be overwhelming if we don't start paying attention to nature.
I think that's so I got the poll back, so we'll kind of let you know who's listening to this. Not that the replay audience doesn't matter, but about 2/3 of the people right now on the live webinar are defined as C-level or senior executives, and then about the other third roughly are developer, product owner, engineers, and then there's a small percentage, one person, two people that have identified themselves as kind of a investor type mind. So we can kind of contextualize this talk around, if I'm in a position where I'm designing product, developing product, kind of not that maybe I'm someone who was in charge with deploying that code that was maliciously faking a task, sure. Right? Yeah. I don't want to do that. What is my role? What's my responsibility? What's my opportunity today? And then also, obviously, the people that may not be down in the weeds like that are trying to understand the unintended consequences of the macro and how it's going to impact their enterprise and their opportunity. Let's talk a little bit about pervasive computing. So let's kind of move into that concept, because that was kind of the net of how you guys defined this impact of trillions. You've related it to me in other talks about my body has 50 trillion cells. There's a new book I'm reading right now called 10% Human that just came out that's about how 9 out of 10 of those are actually microbes, meaning I think parlay between this.
That's not counting the microbiome. Yeah.
These microbes that aren't actually human cells, they're bacteria and they're living, but that's 90% of our body. 90% of our universe moving forward might be IoT. It might be industrial internet. It might be networks of networks of networks. Yeah. And you've done a lot of work, not only with Autodesk, but prior to that, around these concepts of species and economies and ecologies. And so let's talk about however you want to move into kind of this new framework of how we have to even think about.
Well, yeah. So when I wrote Trillions, I kind of thought, hey, I've sent up the flare gun. Like, complexity's coming sooner than you think, and you can't get there from here. You have to go down and ford across the river and learn a new bunch of skills for the next climb. So a sea of information devices. I think what I didn't really take into account was we had done a lot of work around human-centered design, putting people first, co-creation. And if you can hide complexity, sometimes you can hide it in engineering. Computers are better at remembering stuff than humans. Right. Sometimes you can hide it in design because you can give something a form or a function, or you can kind of use that thing to make something desirable or magical. But sometimes you can hide the complexity because the brain is incredible. And the brain is a kind of science that we know a little bit about. And we would see 80% reduction in time on task for managing the command post for an entire factory or distillery with just basic putting people first and understanding the cognitive side of things. But what I didn't understand, so I already knew that was moving to the corner office already, right? Design is a strategic differentiator, and we've seen this now. And putting people first, like actually understanding what humans are capable of and what humans suck at, too, because we all have blind spots and shortcuts. What I didn't take into account was that there was going to be a rise of another species of cognition, not organic cognition like me and monkeys and squirrels and elephants, who all have this suite of crazy, amazing stuff from a 3 billion-year-old R&D lab called Earth. I didn't see there was going to be a rise of silicon cognition, machine learning, that would be fast enough, because it was always 5 years away and people were sent out to the wilderness for a while, because even though the ideas and the theories were there, I didn't understand that suddenly machine learning, this other intelligence, cognition, I wouldn't say intelligence, I would say cognition, has joined the fray. And
just so you guys know, I pulled this screenshot off of one of your 2015 videos, but I think it just helps visualize as you talk. So just kind of talk.
You bet. And right there at the bottom is like Trillions, right? We're going to have a sea of information devices. What I didn't understand was those things would have their own opinions, and they'd have their own ability because of the IoT to do A/B testing. So it'd be the combination of IoT, trillions of things, with a feedback loop because they've got machine learning. And oh, by the way, they can request hardware updates or software updates, right? So that's digital manufacturing. We could 3D print a patch, or we could send a code patch. There's never been a time before. Right?
Yeah, so like
crazy liquidity.
Yeah, examples
between atoms and bits.
Yeah, examples. Sorry to kind of. Yeah. I want you to keep going on that, because we've talked about this like in other things, right? Products are now their focus group. Products now have opinions, and at the same time, most companies, most enterprise leaders are trying to figure out how to be human first and deal with customer experience and integrate that across the silos. Yeah. So wait, now my products have opinions as well as my customer, and they might violate each other. And I know you've used examples of like automated driving and ethics and things, but
products not only have opinions, but they can be influencers, right? And how do you manage an influencer platform when we've already seen how the first IoT device, this one, became a pretty impressive influencer to all of us because it was in context. These things are in context. They own that real estate called the wall in your kitchen or living room, and they're there. And either the data is pouring on the ground as industrial waste, or somebody is capturing it and going, wow, at 3 a.m., Bobby is checking the refrigerator. Husband and wife seem to be fighting over the temperature all the time. They're actually there. They don't have to go through a web page. They own that part of the real estate, and they're in context so they can actually find new value streams. So I get to this point, and this diagram was kind of my first way of saying, okay, wait, we're probably going to co-create because we can't solve all these problems ourselves. Ecosystems, you've got pioneer organisms that get in, like startups, who make sure the ground even works. And then you've got like others that can take advantage of it in a symbiotic way. And then you finally got royal organisms, the blue bloods. They need everything else there. Like, you could never have done a Nest thermostat until everybody had a home router and everyone had a phone. And then suddenly an entire new thing comes out that's new value, that's co-created. So I felt like this was actually not a sea of information devices. This was a primordial soup. This was this churning moment when the very nature of things was going to change from dumb and static, set it up, hope the world doesn't change, to feedback loops and dynamic and like a balancing act. And so suddenly the very nature of things would change. And that's the current large research effort I'm on called Primordial. And that has only happened once in the nature of life before. And we went from a bunch of molecules bumping around to single-celled organisms. And now I think we're at that same moment.
The last time it happened was the Big Bang. Is that what you're getting at?
No, you know what? I think certainly a bunch of stuff happened at the Big Bang. When you say nature, it's everything. But if you look at the origin of life, there's this sort of theory that enough lightning and enough stuff was there, the basic parts were there to basically, enough energy was put in, and suddenly we had our first, it was called the primordial ooze.
Gotcha.
And we had this suddenly life emerged on this planet. And it started being able to look at itself. And so I think we're at that point with the IoT and the fact that we have machine learning. So now we can learn, we can have feedback loops. That's what the first organisms had to have. They had to be able to sense if a shadow floated over them that might be something that would eat them. And then they had to be able to take action, like run away. And maybe that's digital manufacturing. I can use robotics and I can use other things to actually change things. I can manipulate stuff. So I can learn, I can have feedback, and I can build that. That's what you needed for life, and now our things are starting to actually have those three constituent components. So I think we're waiting for the spark.
And we could argue maybe even the spark has come, and now we're trying to deal with it. I don't know what would define do you think the spark at this point?
I don't know. I actually do think. Well, so I think what we're doing now is we're kind of trying to show off that we can get like a two-legged dog that Dr. Owen owns to walk on its hind legs all the time. I think we're trying to take these 1950s and 60s technologies that have been incredible boon for us. I mean, Silicon Graphics, Silicon Valley and everything came out of a lot of real science that went into building this thing called the internet and went into building this thing, called TCP/IP and things. But what we haven't done is we haven't invested in the hardest science of all, because we keep calling it a soft science. And so all the engineers look away when I say, well, actually, we're going to have to actually start understanding cognition. And not just silicon cognition, because silicon cognition is really brittle, but really powerful.
Right.
But human cognition, it's probably the hardest science of all, but it's actually what's going to either get us the spark, and we're going to actually start cherishing cognition, or it's going to actually lead to the great cognitive depression. So we aren't taking it seriously at all.
Yeah. And so part of the reason why that, I don't want to say maybe it's a binary reality, but why one of those binary realities could show up or show up in different various places, but is because, and this goes kind of to Rebecca's research and case, but we're basically not too far out of the cave cognitively from a human standpoint.
Yeah.
And so when we face things that show up to us on a daily basis, like simple overwhelm around, I'm being controlled by this device that I actually purchased and thought was to make my life easier. But when it buzzes at me, or when I see a headline, or when whatever these things that you've called in the past malicious denial of service attacks on cognition.
Yeah.
When I'm just overwhelmed, like how it shows up to most of us. And again, the thinking people, I'm not talking about even 99% of the world that doesn't, 10 webinars like this yet, and hopefully will someday. Thinking people go, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed. I don't know how to solve my own basic problem.
That's right. And when you're overwhelmed, what you do is you fall back on shortcuts. And so shortcuts are just these ways that our brain developed over a long, long time to deal in uncertainty, with danger, to stay alive. So these are evolutionary survival skills. And so there's a part of our brain that consumes a lot of sugar. It's super energy intensive to actually think. It's actually pretty intensive to pay attention to something for a long period of time. It's really energy intensive to add up math and to do math, or to make ethical decisions. You have to actually engage a lot of neurons to do that, and it draws down this fuel tank that you have of cognition pretty aggressively. It's like sort of hitting the gas on the turbocharger, right? So we've got this gas tank, and we wake up every morning with this sort of, let's see if I can draw it over here, with our brain as this gas tank, and there's like a chamber for attention, and there's a chamber for cognition and comprehension, like understanding something. There's a chamber for memory. There's a chamber for social interaction, like how do we interact with authority figures, and how do we interact in small teams and big teams and groups and families and communities, and other chambers. And you hit the gas and it goes pouring out and you lose it. Like that level goes down, this level goes down, and you don't get it back for like a day. You've got to sleep, and you have to sleep more than 8 hours. You got to exercise. You got to like get your body out into nature. They've shown some things that will actually refuel you. And there are some tricks of growing your cognition. You learn new skills over your life. But here's the problem. These beautiful things that have led to amazing new things, what's kind of happening right now is because we have silicon cognition, but we don't have very good silicon cognition yet, we have just turned them into another animal that's about to bite us. And we've turned them into this threat. And it's kind of like the new industrials. You know, in the 1960s, and 70s, we had these industrials that would go in and kind of strip mine whole areas of natural resource.
Right.
They'd put together like Frankenstein molecules that turned out to be, you know, cancer-causing later and other things, and then they dump them in the river when they were done with them. And we started to see the rise of sort of sites that we had to clean up. And I think what's happening now is this cognition's pouring out, and it's pouring into a giant toxic waste dump, you know, that is being strip mined from some of the new industrials. And the only business model for certain people that have apps on these phones is your eyeballs.
Right.
It's capturing your eyeballs and selling them to somebody else. You are not the consumer, you're the product. And so, and they're using sort of dark patterns to do this. Right?
One of my favorite analogies I've heard you say, I don't know if it was at a TED Talk or what, because I don't think it was on one of our conversations, is, you know, Google's acquisition of Nest, right, was essentially the equivalent of putting an oil well between your living room and your kitchen. Yeah. So when you think of these new industrials, what we're talking about is not just eyeballs, right? Because I'm eyeballing.
It's your whole brain.
But the data exhaust that can be mined from that dial up, dial down, you know, husband and wife kind of battle that goes on in the middle of the night or what have you. The intent, the search-based intent, and the algorithmic, and again, there's been benefit to all these things.
Tons of benefits, yeah. But we've ignored the soft sciences because they're actually really too hard. And so, but actually, people with giant machine systems, big social media companies, social networks, they actually have been using dark patterns, sort of patterns that we actually know drain your brain faster. And they're using them to actually capture your eyeballs now. So this is kind of a denial of attention attack, and they're habituating us to lower amounts of attention at machine scale. And to believe that I'm strong enough to combat a denial of attention attack is probably folly, right? We want to be really strong about it. Well, I'm a thinking man. I can turn my phone off. I'm not sure in 5 years you'll be able to. And I'm not sure when all the rest of the IoT things are there, all of them begging for your attention, all of them using dark patterns. I'm not sure what's going to happen. And so what we're going to do is we're going to fall back on the only thing we have left. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky are two famous Nobel-winning economists and behavioral scientists and social scientists. And they did an interesting experiment, a whole bunch of them, amazing work. They did an interesting experiment where they took an ethical problem, pull the lever, the speeding train is going towards the track. Pull the lever one way and you only kill one person that we happen to have tied down to the train track. But if you pull the lever the other way, it goes into the train station and kills a whole bunch of people. And in the morning, they would do this test. And you'd be fresh. You've got that whole cognitive reserve. You've got lots of capacity. And you've got this part of the brain called the slow part of the brain that actually consumes tons of energy because it has to really think. And ethics takes tons of thinking. It's a hard thing. You could give the problem in the morning, and people would do pretty good on it. They'd do okay on basic ethical questions. Then if you took out a deck of cards, and you just showed them a card and said, please add 3 to this card. So I'll do it with you, Chris. I'm going to actually drain your ethical abilities. Please don't make any other ethical decisions for the rest of the day. I pulled out a 9 of clubs. I want you to just add 3 and say what it is.
A queen.
Okay. I pulled out 2 of diamonds.
A 2 of diamonds. Okay, so then there would be a 5 of diamonds.
Sure. I pull out a 7 of spades.
10 of spades.
Great. So if I do this for 5 minutes, maybe 10, and then I give you a similarly challenging ethical dilemma, what has done? I've done. I'm burning out your slow part of the brain. I'm using you're consuming all your sugar in this trivial task, just like what we do on our phones every day when we wake up. Now, the slow part of the brain it's dead. It goes to sleep. It literally goes to sleep. It just can't be worked. So there's another part of the brain that's the fast part of the brain. I don't know if have you ever driven a car for like a half an hour and gone, what? I don't remember driving that.
Right, all the time. Sure.
Yeah, that's the lizard part.
Now I
can't even think about it. Right? And so that part of the brain is the fast part because it has to make decisions in uncertainty. It's got danger. I mean, I don't want to get eaten, right? And so it's a pile of shortcuts that don't consume much energy. And so what I do is I burned out the thoughtful part. Now I just grab it. It tries to wake up the slow part. It goes, hey, buddy, come on, this is one of yours. But he doesn't say, I can't make ethical decisions right now because we're just not that aware of our own thinking. Instead, it goes, I don't know, kill them all. It just gets happy. And so imagine you wake up in the morning and by 9 o'clock in the morning, you've got to go to work and actually do hard work. And people that are not cherishing the cognition of their employees, who are just IT guys throwing in more and more stuff and not recognizing what silicon cognition really is decades away from being able to do, gleefully putting these kinds of things in your company, you're strip mining your own employees so they can't pay attention. There was a recent article, a research report, where they tested people with a phone turned off in their room. And they looked to see if you still drained cognitive load, if you literally drained some of your gas tank with it turned off. And it turns out you still have to continually pay attention because you don't know when it'll bite you. Because the minute you turn it on, it might have like a bill from the telephone company, not a big deal. Or it might have like a long lost love, it just sends you a note. Or it might be some really weird bad thing, like, oh my God, what just happened? So even if it's turned off, it drains. And by 10 o'clock in the morning, you're kind of gone. And so this has never happened before. And what do? We fall back in this rise of complexity. We fall back on authority bias. Well, it's just easier to follow somebody than to actually think about it. Or we fall back on the law of the instrument. If I'm a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Or we fall back on all these other biases that when we were hunting mammoths were great, man. They kept us alive, but they're still there. And when we burn out the slow, thoughtful part of our brain, it's gone.
So what are the hacks? How do you life hack that? Or what have you?
I love this.
Because I know you're researching this, but
yeah, there are all sorts of wonderful ones. So this is the idea of letting people see the thinking about their thinking, and then building habits. It turns out you don't change tomorrow to suddenly be a weightlifter. You don't change tomorrow to suddenly be a drug dealer. You have a slippery slope where each little step you still are the hero. And slippery slopes, you can look up the work of Dan Ariely, has some beautiful world-class sort of scaled research in this. You start out and you do something, and you still go, I'm still the hero because I didn't do it for me, I did it for somebody else. And then you're a little more, and then a little more, and then pretty soon you're like a big drug dealer, but you have to keep being a hero. But it turns out all positive habits are formed the same way. You actually do a little thing, and it builds a habit. Every day, maybe you keep a journal of the great things that happened today. You'll actually feel a little better in a month. You actually start to actually reward yourself for better things. You can start building attention. There's a wonderful book called Learning How to Learn. Barbara Oakley has studied this and has looked at how humans learn. You need to go to sleep, or you don't do this other part of the brain that actually is called the diffuse mode. When you're asleep, it chains together. Think of it as almost, let's see if I can draw over here, a pinball game. And you've got all these little bumpers. And in the day, you shoot a ball up and it bounces around between all the connections you know. Pretty easy, right? But you don't make big new ideas. You keep bouncing around up here. When you go to sleep, it bounces way over here, it gets flipped up, it bounces over here, it's up, and it starts to build sort of chains of associations that actually start building muscles. And so there are these wonderful ways that we can actually use the fact that we go to sleep to cancel another big problem, which is the illusion of mastery. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but somebody goes, oh, wow, yeah. I see other people talk on stage. I could totally do that. I'm an expert at talking. I talk to 5 people all the time. Then they get up on stage. They've got dry mouth. They start to have the fight or flight response. And they're like, and they start to sweat because they want to run because they didn't have a mastery.
Right.
And so one last thing, and it's sort of a life hack thing, and it relates to this board I have right here. This is a skill that the best CEOs, chairmen of the board, and startups have. Drawing, but not drawing for pretty. This isn't pretty, I'm sorry.
Right.
Drawing for meaning, because drawing is the lingua franca between disciplines. If you say to me, well, no, it's about this thing called a digital currency, and the currency flows into this kind of bigger pool, you do that, you're using nouns, you're using verbs to show action with arrows, and even if I don't even know the topic, I can at least go, I don't think that's the right model. And
right.
You can use jargon, I can use jargon, but the wall helps. It's also really low friction, right? I can do this, and I don't feel like, you don't feel like, oh my God, you destroyed my beautiful artwork. Right. So it's a very low friction way to get interdisciplinary teams to collaborate. But here's the trick. So what if we could, instead of draining our cognition, what if we could create like a flywheel? Kind of think of it as your Prius or regenerative braking, right? When you hit the brakes, what happens?
Charges the battery.
It charges the battery, yeah. So what if in the act of us using comprehension, like building muscles, we've got to actually do the work. We're going to drain, like let's say comprehension, this part here, we're going to drain. In the act of it, we spin up a flywheel because it's actually teaching us a skill that can actually build memory. And whiteboards do that. So it turns out you can remember about 7 ± 2 things in short-term memory. So you can remember, it's a 2.5-second loop in Western languages. So you can remember a phone number, and you can loop it in your head for a while and keep it in your head until you can write it down. So that's a short-term loop that we can do. But you get into a meeting room, there's no whiteboards, there's a giant projection screen, and somebody shows you 70 slides of a presentation. Well, it turns out you can only keep 7, and you're going to mostly listen to the charismatic one at the end or something. So now you don't have many thoughts to actually be able to manipulate if you want to be creative. But here's the trick. In the physical world, well, let's see, I'll draw it right here. In the physical world, the space, and this works for squirrels, this works for humans, this works for elephants, all organic cognition got this for free out of 3 billion years of R&D. The space remembers for us. So if I learn how to draw for meaning as a leader, draw to get my ideas out, draw to collaborate with myself, draw to collaborate with people who think differently than me, but I know that real good stuff is at the intersection, I can remember 1, 10, 1,000, 100, 1,000, 10,000. It turns out most humans, in fact, all humans, most squirrels, all elephants, probably even more, can remember 10,000 things in physical space. The squirrel goes and finds what it buried 3 months later, right? So we get this for free. We have a mental model and a huge amount of cognition dedicated to the physical world, because that stuff didn't change. So we could offload cognition. It's called bounded rationality. We would sort of put it out into the world so we wouldn't have to make that decision. And you can look up something called Simon's scissors, which is the Nobel-winning science behind this, which is that your brain is one part the brain, and that's running the rules, like the ant looking for sugar. But since the world doesn't change, it leaves a little path behind so that other ants can follow. It doesn't have it in its brain at all. It's only got like 20 neurons. I'm sure it has more than that, but it has a small number of neurons. And then the other part of the ant is actually the environment it pushes against. Physics, earth, gravity, all that stuff. So it can offload to this algorithm that doesn't change, the earth. And so what you get is you get this emergence at the beginning of a pair of scissors. You can't look at one blade, you have to look at both. When they slice together, something pops out. And so what pops out? Well, ants like farm fungus, ants fight battles, ants keep their anthill at 70 degrees. Where the heck is all that complexity? It's beautiful complexity instead of malignant complexity. And it comes from being able to balance the environment and the brain. So if you can't change a person, change the environment, you get very different effects. And the whiteboard is one of the ways to change a business environment. But it's actually one of the best ways to actually build a new capacity in your brain. So when other people are like lost, you can actually keep track of 10,000 things.
Right.
That's why things like this sketchbook is filled with pictures.
Yeah.
Because it's where it is what it is. That's the phenomena that we discovered at Maya in research some 20-some years ago. We started documenting it. We would see 400% increase in decision-making using decision-making software if we just actually cherished the physical space as a way of offloading your cognition. We would see 300% improvements in situational awareness because we're just built for this. So now we're cherishing our brain and playing to a strength. And so I could imagine someday having like You know how Google has to write a special chunk of code when they're in China, because of some laws. What if the governor of California said, well, you know what? We're going to actually commit to cognition as a human right. We're going to say we need to build more capacity in all of our people because we've got the hardest challenges ahead, and we can't just defer to our simian instincts or something left from mammoth days, right? And we're not going to allow Google to strip mine our cognition. So when you are geolocated in California, you have to put up a little FDA label that says, this is the decognitive stuff I'm doing. I'm strip mining this because I think it's really useful. I'm draining this. Please don't make any ethical decisions for the rest of the day. And other people could put up the little FDA label, that's on the oranges. It could say things like, if you use this app, you're going to actually walk away with a little bit more cognitive capacity. You're going to be able to build muscles that actually teach you to have longer attention spans. So I think we could have both decognition taxes and decognition regulations like that, and we could have cherishing cognition incentives, just the same way we had them for getting rid of fossil fuel. But we don't even have policymakers talking about this because complexity has strip mined everybody to the point where we're all falling back to like, well, let's just bet on the most charismatic figure or the best.
That's a nice segue to something I wanted to wrap up with here, maybe in the last 10 minutes, which is departing. But I think you gave everybody, including me, some really cool, practical, pragmatic things we can walk away from. Where it is, what it is, whiteboarding. Doing the little thing to restore our cognition, even if that means not answering my emails before I get out of bed or not turning on, not doing that.
Go for a walk in the woods. Certain people are also early birds and certain people are night owls. And in adolescence, a lot larger proportion of people shift over to night owls. So they found that if you just start the school day an hour or two later, all the kids do way better on tests.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's also understanding time. We didn't talk about time, but think of the things that are the physics of the world. Those are stable, which means we've got hacks for them. And we are so much better than silicon cognition, like a self-driving car, because we build something called common sense. We build a mental model. So these are real things we can think about. And if we design patterns to cherish cognition, I think we're going to get rewarded in the market. Because
I know that a lot of your work at Autodesk and just out in the world mentoring, doing all the things that you do, most of which I think now you just do because you want to. I'm really worried, and this is like now a sacred mission. I think I just need to get people to know, and there are real things we can do, but there's a lot of science that has to happen. I think something like 30 or 40% of the social science papers that everybody cites since 2010, 2015, a large study was just done, and 20 or 30% of them weren't reproducible, even with larger sample sizes. Because we mostly only use guinea pigs in laboratories. And when I say guinea pigs, I mean undergraduate students in Western educated colleges, because they've been the test subjects. So there's actually a lot of science and probably a lot of money to be made in finding that science and translating it into business to cherish cognition. Well, I think we need, we live in a time where, you mentioned time just a minute ago, and I think, we live in this thing where humanity's had a really nice long run. We live and have more access today to things than we ever have in history, and yet I think we all, as leaders, or just concerned thinkers, can share your sacred mission of, I feel like we don't have enough time, and yet I also, the optimist in me, the doer in me, actually believes that the solutions are here, but it's conversations and actions based on conversations like this that get us there. The little bit does a lot. When I think about, and this isn't about debating whether it's good, bad, right, or wrong. When I think about things like One Belt, One Road, right, and if we just think about what
this is sort of China initiative to recapitulate the Silk Road,
and so One Belt, One Road is kind of essentially the easiest way to think about it as it relates to your analogy of reverting to habit or cognitive bias is, okay, so we are going to open up and we're going to lend, we're going to export our debt, we're going to lend it to all these other markets. If they can't pay us back, and this is my own bias, but my own understanding, if they can't pay us back, like Sri Lanka, what we'll do is we'll take control of their port on a 99-year lease. So they now have this new infrastructure, but we ultimately now have a new place to put naval ships.
Maybe a bait and switch or something. I'm not sure exactly what that is.
Whether it is or it isn't, it may be. Let's just take the.
It may be genuine, and it's just bad decision making.
That it's just purely intended with all the right things. Let's say that China's leadership is purely intending the right things, and let's say that America's leadership thinks it's purely intending the right things. The bottom line is that these conversations, and we talk about cognition the way you're talking about it, all we ever hear about is artificial intelligence, machine learning, and things like that. We hear about singularity, and everyone's trying to figure out what the regulations are against everything from cryptocurrencies to all these new models that don't fit in the world that we have, because this is like, to your point, if this is a primordial ooze, we have never been here before because we came out of the last one over millions of years of evolution and R&D. So this idea that any of us is actually able to make the ethical right decision beyond a certain point of our day starts with just admitting where we can't, and I don't want to say doing less, but how do you scale? And so it's this like weird construct, right? And in my mind, I think about this as a math problem. It's like you have the ability now to communicate faster. Factories are now networks, not physical spaces. Theoretically, you could print stuff anywhere in the world through 3D print points, and 20% of all manufacturing, so supposedly over the next 8 to 10 years, will be done on demand, insight. You could email something to space like a wrench, right? Like all these.
So the first one, I'm just going to draw while you're talking to show you a little trick, right? So the first one, we were talking about minds, right? We were talking about there are like human minds, and there are these new robot minds, the silicon cognition. And I'll just use square boxes because, robots are kind of square. Great. And now you just talked about digital manufacturing and automation and robotics, where we can actually lower the barrier between atoms and bits. So those minds are starting to impact atoms. Yeah, and the interesting thing is we could design and make very differently, right? We're starting to see new generative design tools that actually help you hack one of your problems, which is selection bias, by having it generate many sort of genetic variations on a new building and try to optimize for like its goal. Like, so think about this. Let's say I'm building a building.
You could do that with trade routes too. You don't have to go back to Marco Polo days, which is obviously that counts out of the bag. They've committed $1 trillion. They've deployed, but one belt road, one road's happening. Whether it's a success or not, or what it does but it's happening. But the reality is we could be from here forward designing, letting a computer take our end game,
the goals,
of opportunities.
Well, and I think if I were to draw the verb of this arrow between minds being able to shape atoms in new ways, which is pretty interesting with generative design and with robotic printing of things, even buildings, right? We just had a bridge premiere at Eindhoven Design Week that two robots were set on pretty much two sides of things, and they wove a bridge, right, out of steel. So suddenly infrastructure looks very different when you can do what nature does, which is in the spring we grow leaves, and in the fall we drop them back down and put them back into the currency. We could do this with our buildings. So this verb here is from specifying what we think we want, but we really don't understand because our brains are hacked, to goal-oriented. Like the goal of a neonatal center in a hospital is to reduce infant mortality. And the goal is to make sure the baby and mom don't have to come back because they got an infection. That's the goal. Now, what we do is we specify a bunch of stuff. It's got to be about 2 meters by 4 meters. We're going to have a vent here to kind of try to blow the air through, but also keep opportunistic infections up. But infant mortality rates are actually on the rise right now in the United States. What if the goal was reduce infection? I don't care how. Reduce infection in that building, reduce readmission, and keep babies alive. Help increase that. Now, the building is a mind. It's this mind over here. It doesn't have a mental model, but you got the facility manager, and you've got the doctors, and you've got that. And if they collaborate, you end up with something where at some point the building learns, it subscribes to other peers. It learns from other hospital neonatal units, just like we do. We learn from our peers. And then if it had a mental model, or even the beginning of it, which we're starting to explore with some new work I'm doing, very basic, it could do A/B testing until it actually helps in very small ways, do no harm, where it can actually do like a 1% improvement every month. And at some point it might say, I'm sending out an RFP, me, the building, because this room is not working. And you need to tear it down, and you need to put it back out into the world so that it's back out into the world to be used. So there's a fascinating opportunity here, and that I am optimistic about this. because if I draw another set of circles, we need more stuff than ever. More is inevitable, right? We've got 350,000 people joining the global middle class every day, if you look at Hans Rosling's work, right? So more is inevitable. We're going to have to build 3,600 new buildings a day by 2050. Not infrastructure, just the buildings, not the highways, not the hospitals. More than we make today to handle 10 billion people on the planet. So more is inevitable, but we only have one planet, and frankly, we've been building Frankenstein materials like rebar, metal inside of concrete that probably nature never would have done. Less is a reality. We have less skilled workforces for this new emerging world. We have less raw materials. We have less ability to think about this. So we've got this tension between more is inevitable, less is a reality, and I think right here is better. But it means that we're going to probably need new kinds of policies about AI, new kinds of policies about minds, new ways of thinking about making that not only when you design something you design for this life, but you design for the next life, so that it can be shown that when you make a building, it can return back into the natural resources, unlock capital so that it can go somewhere else. So it's from specification to goal directed. That's amazing. We've never been able to do that for design today. We've also got bits, so stuff flows, right? That gets the ideas around. And this new synergy here, this allows us atoms and bits. Wow, we've got the IoT. We can actually sense and respond for the first time. And what's neat about that is that from here to here, we can go from summative assessment, like I'm going to give you a test for a new skill. I'll sum it up with an A-B choice, summative. I'm glad I can't write. To formative, because we can sense it. You don't have to take a test. If I see that you know how to extrude a box in a CAD software, and I see that you adjust the presets a bunch, then you demonstrated your skill by doing. So it wasn't learn at a school and then do. A fixed knowledge is antique. It's almost like building the muscles for the next muscle and dynamically getting feedback so it's n equals 1 to the world. So if we could go to formative assessment, which people have shown in learning, of the buildings too, by the way, if we could do formative assessment of our infrastructure, like see what really works and actually tune it and try to make it better, if we could build this is kind of an ecology, right? Because all those different players from the pioneers to the royal organisms all start playing together, and it's mutualism. And it becomes this sort of place for that to happen where new economics pop out. So I mean, this is a silly kind of drawing, but it forces you to go, what are the policies for minds? What are the policies for atoms? What are the policies for bits and how they intersect? And that would force you to do things. I'll give you a mind policy. The Ford Foundation invested over 5 years in multiple cities with 3 or 4 industries in a 401k for learning that was portable. They basically said, we'll give the employer the ability to put money into a savings account for an employee, and it'll be portable. If you leave the company, you still get to keep this learning account. And they looked back 5 years later after doing this. There were no tax incentives, by the way. But the employers and the employees ranked it as very useful and valuable. And everyone, a very large percentage of people, were doing better 5 years later economically. They had moved up the chain towards better, more middle class, higher class jobs. So that's an example of a policy, 401k for lifelong learning. Humans have common sense, and we have creativity, and we have passion. Those are pretty innately human. And we've got this crazy brain that can do stunning hacks if we actually cherish it. Now, a lot of people go, well, but machines aren't creative. And that's just wrong. Like, machines are like single-minded, like the best bass player in the world, but they probably aren't the conductor. But they're creative. And we're starting to see a basically commoditization of prediction with machine learning and a commoditization of creativity, sort of web search for things that don't exist. So actually, machines have creativity, but machines don't have common sense, and they don't have passion. The Paul Allen Institute for AI has a $120 million investment out in what's called common sense reasoning, because we're far away from it. That's why you can hack a street sign in Silicon Valley so a car drives right through it, because it thinks it's not a stop sign, it's a giant toaster with a sticker. It's called a adversarial patch. So there's not a 2-year-old has a mental model, has common sense. No machine on the planet does, and there's no AI person in the world that's going to argue with me on this. Like
Right.
Everyone knows it. So it's incredibly brittle. So you think we have biases? These machine learning systems have crazy biases, and they're starting to join the workforce. And some of them are biases left over from the data that we had. Our own personal biases are embedded in the data, hiring data, social service data, et cetera.
What let's finish. This is exactly where we needed to go. I think one of the things we'll clip up out of this and everything else is this concept that you just said of more is inevitable, less is our reality, better lives here. That's a Mickey McManus nugget. We're definitely going to put out and share on social media as a link to this replay. We've had
well, and I want to give credit for Autodesk for this, because this is something that the CEO and the senior strategy team have been saying. Wow, 30% of all waste in the world is construction waste. Everyone uses our tools for design and making. There's such a big opportunity here, and we need to actually cherish Cognition. They're the first ones to tell you, we're going to invest in lifelong learning for our customers. We want people using our tool because they pay us, by the way, they're the real consumer. We want them to walk away from using the tool after 8 hours actually feeling like they have more muscles, just more stuff. And so they came up with this frame, and I've worked with them on this, but we've all worked together to try to really think, what is the big opportunity is better. Yeah, it's going to be different ways of solving it, and we need policymakers and we need startups to get it and start investing.
We need policymakers to understand they're making policies for minds, atoms, and bits, and not just their constituents, which are the minds, right? There's a whole new layer of minds that they have to treat as constituents now, and it's been an absolute pleasure. We actually, up until about 60 seconds ago, we had 100% attendance for 50 minutes, and we still have about 89%. So thank you all who tuned in live for your attention. I understand why you gave it to this man, but I honor it nonetheless, because an hour of time is a major investment from all of us.
Well, this was an experiment for both of us too, right? I didn't know if we'd even.
This is great. Maybe the whiteboard is a key. I gotta force everybody to bring a whiteboard with them from here on out. But Mickey, any parting thoughts? Any best way that people can interact with you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, Mickey McManus. But I would say this: take seriously this idea of cherishing cognition, and think really carefully when you say to somebody like, oh man, he doesn't know how to turn off his phone. Is it really him? Because I think there's like a cottage industry around sort of telling everyone how to have grit and whatever, and turn it off, and almost leadership stuff, kind of by the industries that are actually economically benefiting. So we need to think about ways that we take this seriously, and I think people can do a lot. There's a wonderful online course on Coursera by a psychologist and a scientist at Yale. She found that a lot of freshman students were crazy depressed. Suicides are very high in some of these Ivy League things because they start being the best in their school and high school to being average when they get to college. So they just don't sleep. And so she has an online course about happiness. And actually, knowing is not half the battle. She said it's the G.I. Joe fallacy. Knowing is half the battle, sir. The other half of the battle, I guess, is rockets. But knowing is half the battle. It turns out knowing isn't even 10% of the battle. If you don't build these habits slowly, like this journaling, like this. So it's the most popular course in all of Yale. 25% of all the students go to it. They say it's the hardest course because she makes them exercise their cognition. So that would be a nice place to follow up. If people want to go take a look at that, I think it's stunning.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. And I think, one thing I've said a long time that is in line with that is that the gap between knowing and doing are the largest gaps in human existence. And so knowing is not half the battle. And you just said it's about 10%. And now you gave us a course we can go hopefully fill in the rest with. So thank you, Mickey. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to the next
Always fun, Chris.
And I'm excited for the new book whenever it's ready. I know it's a major work.
I'm about 60% in, and the newest part is Miyagi, and that's a reference to the old Karate Kid movie. But it's sort of about how do we use automation tools to amplify our cognition and maybe build our muscles. Like, Miyagi sent Ralph Macchio out to go wax his car every day. And he was like, "What? You're supposed to be teaching me karate, man. Why are you making me do this? I'm not your slave." And what he was maybe learning was just good skills. Yep. But it might have been that he was actually learning how to block a roundhouse kick during the finale. So he was building a muscle today for tomorrow. Yep. And I think that's the promise. What would happen if we had a movement that was around how do we actually manage this, but also build new muscles no human has ever had before? That would be so fun.
Yeah.
Great for our kids.
Well, I think Emerson was the one who said, I think it was him, do the thing and you get the energy to do the thing. So
yeah. Nice.
Thanks for doing the thing with me today. And I'll look forward to our next chat, buddy.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
Bye, everybody.